And now, last but not least, we have one more speaker in this session. Till Roenneberg is a biologist and medical psychologist. He is professor emeritus at the Medical School of LMU in Munich. Currently, he's president of the World Federation of Societies for Chronobiology. And in his research, Professor Till investigates the human internal clock and sleep in the real world. And I love the title of his talk today. It's called Lock the Clock: The Effects of Social Restrictions on Daylight Timing, Sleep, and Well-Being. Professor Roenneberg, welcome.
Martha, thank you very, very much for this nice introduction. I'm going to talk about the results of a survey that we did because we thought that the epidemic was, as it was there already, quite a good setting for actually an experiment where we could ask people what they did before the pandemic and what they did in a social restriction or lockdown situation. So oops, now two, okay. Can we go back? One. Okay, so the survey went and asked about 50 questions in many languages, which you can see here. And the project period was last year between 4th of April and the 16th of May. The study was done in collaboration with Maria Komen from Israel, who had many ideas and who did a lot of work to get this done. The total population that we've collected was over 10,000 people. And the final population for the analysis was after throwing out people who made mistakes or didn't conclude the study, that the final population was 7,517, with 68% women. The time in lockdown was about over a month, so it was in a way a steady state. What we found, and this is only a teaser because I like problem-based approaches, and I'm showing you the results before you really can understand the results, and then I'll come back to it. So what you see here in the left panel is sleep timing, and what you can see in the horizontal axis is what the sleep timing was before people got into lockdown, and the vertical axis shows you what the sleep timing is when they are in lockdown. And the sleep timing, we are measuring the middle of the sleep from onset to end, the middle of the sleep on free days when people are less restricted due to having to go to work. And you can see the differences here. Sleep timing becomes a bit later. Sleep duration, we'll see what that does, but it's certainly interesting that most of the people who slept too short before the pandemic gained most of their sleep back and slept much longer. And then a concept that I will explain shortly is social jet lag. And the social jet lag concept shows you how much we live against our body clock. And again, the more people lived against their body clock before lockdown, the more they improved their situation. So, but in order to appreciate what I've just shown you, you have to know a bit more about the body clock and how individual it is in the population. So this is a distribution of midpoints of sleep on work-free days or before work-free days when we don't have to set alarm clocks. And what you can see, it is a very biological distribution with a masses of people in the middle, and the further away they get from a mid-sleep of around 4 o'clock, which means that people have slept from midnight to 8 o'clock. The further away we get from that timing, the fewer people consider themselves as such sleep timers. And we know that the extremes have been called larks and owls, but of course, the majority of the population never had a name, and therefore I decided I call them doves. And so we now have a name for the majority of the population in their sleep timing or in their chronotype. Another important aspect that we have to consider when we are trying to understand what's going on with daylight and the biological clock, and consequently thereof, with sleep, is that the body clock listens to light. Of course, looks at light, but it listens to the command of light and darkness, and that comes into a clinch when we look at social time, because what you can see here is in the background, the light colors of red, yellow, green, and blue are the colors that late 19th century were asserted to time zones. And the decisions were quite good because they said nobody has to live further away more than half an hour from sun time. Of course, the sun moves from east to west, and therefore gets later in its sunset or sunrise by 4 minutes every longitude. But we live in time zones that are shown in front in the strong colors, and you can see that the Central European time zone is huge. It goes from bordering Russia and Eastern European countries to north of Portugal. So it's a huge time zone. And body clocks have to live within a time zone. And the fact is that if you look at huge databases and when people sleep, and here you see people, if they sleep early, they're light green. If they sleep late, they are red. And if they sleep sort of in between, they are black. And you see this wave, like the sun going from east to west. You see this wave of sleep timing across Europe. And that shows you that humans, even as industrial people or urbanized people, still react to sun in their sleep timing and in their circadian clocks, like all other plants and animals do, namely listening to the sun. Now, the width of the distribution of chronotypes is huge in modern days, because the earliest larks are about 12 hours apart from the latest owls, so that both could share a bed without ever lying in it at the same time. But this has not always been the case, because this is the distribution of larks to owls in an urban situation where we get very little light during the day because we're inside, and very little darkness after sunset because we're switching on lights. And that makes the signals that set the clock weaker, and therefore we drift apart as a chronotype population. If we take a normal urban population camping, which is taking them out into the sun during the day and into the darkness during the night again, what happens is that the distribution shrinks and becomes earlier. So you can invert that and say what happened from our ancestors to now. We have become later and broader in our chronotype situation, in our sleep timing. Okay. There should be just the mentioning of Ken Wright, who did these camping studies, and I'll try it again. There it is. So Ken Wright published these very nice experiments. This slide is a very short crash course in we call entrainment. Entrainment is nothing else but the active synchronization of a biological function, mainly by sitting in the brain and looking through the eyes out into the world and measuring light and darkness. And when it by this means synchronizes actively to the light-dark cycle, we call that entrainment. This is what used to be the case. We are diurnal animals, day-active animals, and therefore we run around during the day and we sleep at night. And that's how we sleep. These are little bars every day. This is just a sketch of yes, there is variance, but people sleep quite regularly if they don't have any urbanization. But once we get into urbanization, what happens is that we, as I already said, we decrease the amount of light we get during the day. We increase the amount of light we have at night, and therefore we flatten the signal, and this flatter signal leads to the fact that most of us, except for the very early larks, most of us move later in their clocks, and that's the reason why we all need alarm clocks, by the way, which I'm going to show in a second. And what we have introduced, and you can see it in the graph at the right on the bottom, what we have introduced by this is, yes, we need alarm clocks on work days because we still have to go to work relatively early. And therefore, since our clocks are very late, they don't allow us to sleep early. And therefore, we sleep too little during the work week. And therefore, we catch up sleep on the weekends. And this is showing you that we introduced in our history into the regular timing of our behavior, we introduced a weekly structure. This weekly structure is shown here in form of sleep logs that we've collected, many, many hundreds of them. And what you see here is the days from top to bottom. And this recording recording of sleep times is 6 weeks long. And you see the timing of the day when people sleep up there. And midnight is about here. So this person is a late type, goes to bed even on work days quite late. But you see that on Friday evening, it looks like if this person flies to the United States and comes back on Monday morning from Europe. And therefore we said, this is a bit like jet lag. And since we're not flying away, it's not travel jet lag, we decided to call it social jet lag. And there are very few people in the industrialized urban world, namely 13%, who do not suffer from this modern syndrome called social jet lag. Now, what happens to sleep during the lockdown? You've seen this graph before. And during lockdown, sleep timing is slightly delayed, but the important notion, or the important information of this left graph is that it's independent of your chronotype. Whether you were early or late, you will become a bit later, and that might be due to the fact that we're getting a bit less light during the lockdown because we can't go outside. I'll come back to that. The interesting changes in sleep duration from pre to within lockdown are very, very important to look at, because the less sleep you got before, the more you caught up when you get into lockdown. And the interesting thing is those people who slept 8.5 hours before did not change anything. So it seems that there is a new set point for sleep duration for most of the population, and that might be longer than we thought. It's also interesting that the more you suffered from social jet lag, the more you changed your behavior so that you reduced your social jet lag, dependent on how much you had before the lockdown. And now you can see that those people who only had 20 minutes of social jet lag can tolerate this, and they didn't change anything. So again, we have a notion of how much we tolerate, and it's the 20 minutes. Okay, again, yes. Interesting is that we have people who used alarm clocks, most of them did, before the lockdown, and we have other people who stopped using them during lockdown, and then we have another group that continued to use them during lockdown, and that's what we're going to look at here. So the increase in, or the becoming later in sleep timing, more into our own biological windows, is only possible, or is much more possible, if you do not use an alarm clock, which is sort of trivial, but it has to be shown quantitatively. Can somebody give me the next slide, please? Yes. Sleep duration was also increased only significantly if you did not use an alarm clock. And social jet lag has the greatest effect if you don't use an alarm clock during the lockdown. So it's the alarm clock that is actually the culprit for most of what we're dealing with. And now we come to light, and I have a couple of minutes left. And what you see here is that before the lockdown, there was a distribution of how much light people got outside. That's the outdoor light exposure, or OLE. And there was something between 0 and 4 hours. And during lockdown, you accumulated most of the people on the left, and that means they got very little light. But for every detail that we looked at, there was a majority of people who got less light or didn't change from pre to in lockdown, but there were some people who even increased their outdoor light exposure. And now we can look at the consequences of getting more light than others during lockdown. And in general, people got less light in the lockdown than before. But the more light people got within the lockdown, the better their sleep quality, the higher their quality of life, the shorter their screen time, and the more they were active, which is clear because when you go out, you're more active than if you stay inside. And again, okay, here we go. From before to during, we increased our sleep duration, and the longer people slept, the better their sleep quality and the higher their quality of life. And most people became later, as we've already seen, and the later people got, the better their sleep quality, because they're now moving into their own biological sleep windows, and interestingly, the shorter their screen time. So as a summary, the pandemic had, despite too many bad consequences, also positive outcomes. And that is more flexible work schedules, more home office. We have shown industry that the society doesn't collapse if people work from home, which is very important because it's good for health. It lengthens sleep, it reduces social jet lag, it improves health thereby, because sleep is one of the biggest guarantees for keeping healthy, staying healthy. And on top of that, it decreased the carbon footprint because we had less commuting to work, and we're using actually the commute time to sleep, which is great because it reduces the carbon footprint and it increases health in two ways. And the air traffic was down. And finally, there's always this thing about the daylight savings time. Daylight savings time is actually nothing else but a time schedule arrangement of the entire country or of people, and now we can reduce it to what it is. Everybody with a higher flexibility can actually go to work during the summer month an hour earlier without the entire population having to follow their individual needs. This is what I wanted to tell you. There are always many people involved in big studies, and all of the results you've seen were the results of big studies, and I thank all of them who are lovely colleagues. And with that, I leave you or I'm open to answer questions.